Most of my work is contract-based, short-term IT support for municipal systems that no one wants to maintain internally. Records reconciliation, backup verification, access audits after staff turnover. It's mostly comparing tables, checking hashes, documenting discrepancies that usually come down to formatting errors or legacy software. I work alone, from home, odd hours. The city prefers it that way, less overhead. Because of that work, I keep accounts on a few fringe forums in mirrors, not for browsing exactly. Incident response reports and breach disclosures sometimes surface there before they're formalized. It saves time to know what's circulating. I don't use those spaces socially. I download, catalog, move on. It's habitual at this point. That night was routine. Late, after finishing a reconciliation job tied to emergency services backups. I'd been awake too long and was mostly cleaning up loose ends. I checked an old leak index I keep bookmarked, more out of habit than intent. One mirror was still responding. Barely. The directory tree was thin, most links dead. One entry caught my attention because it was plain. No description, just a file name and a checksum string. The name was formatted as a timestamp followed by a regional code. The code matched my city's internal designation. That alone isn't unusual, but it was specific enough to register. I didn't think much of it. I noted the time, 01:43 local, logged my system state out of habit, VPN active, isolated VM, standard setup. The file was small, encrypted, but not aggressively. The packet structure looked clean, no padding anomalies. The checksum matched the listing. That mattered more to me than the content. The archive layout was what convinced me to keep going. Top-level container, no nesting errors, consistent naming conventions. It resembled data exports I'd handled before. Not amateur, not sloppy. Whoever packaged it knew what they were doing, or at least followed an internal standard. I remember hesitating briefly, not because it felt risky, but because it felt unnecessary. I already had enough work queued up, but this was the kind of thing I was paid to look at indirectly. Files surface, you verify them. You don't assign meaning yet. So I downloaded it, logged the checksum locally, added a note in my archive tracker. Unlabeled encrypted file, regional match, low priority review. Then I went back to closing out my task list. At the time, it didn't feel like a decision, just another file to catalog before shutting down for the night. I didn't open the file right away. The next evening, after a full day of routine tickets, I came back to it mostly because it was still sitting in my tracker as unresolved. I decrypted it using the same tools I use for municipal exports that come in half-documented formats. The encryption wasn't complex. Layered obfuscation, a time-based key derived from the file name, then standard compression. It felt familiar, almost lazy. Once decoded, it resolved into a flat data set. No folders, just a single table. Numbered entries, each with a date field, a set of coordinates, and an alphanumeric string that looked like an internal reference ID. There were no headers beyond basic field markers, no names, no descriptions. It could have been anything. I scanned the formatting first, fixed width fields, padding consistent across entries. The date format matched what our emergency systems use internally, not what's exposed publicly. That stood out, but not enough to mean anything on its own. I exported a copy and ran a quick integrity check. No corruption, no missing rows. Out of habit, more than curiosity, I picked a recent date and searched local news. There had been a fatal traffic incident a few days prior. The coordinates in one entry were within a few meters of the reported location. That happens. Cities reuse datasets all the time. I assumed it was recycled or scraped data. I checked an older entry against public death records. It lined up again. Different cause, different neighborhood, still close enough to register. I told myself it was coincidence layered on coincidence, the kind you notice only after you start looking. I work with records. Patterns show up whether you want them to or not. What unsettled me slightly wasn't the matches, but the ones that didn't show up anywhere obvious. Dates with no articles, no press releases.
I cross-referenced emergency response logs I still had access to from a previous contract. Some aligned with incidents that never made it past internal reporting. Medical calls, industrial accidents, the kind of things that don't always become public. I focused on the structure instead of the content. The identifiers followed the same checksum logic used in our records, but the prefixes were wrong. Off by one character, close enough to be intentional, not close enough to be official. Data drift, I told myself. Data export errors happen when systems talk to each other badly. I made notes in my tracker. High correlation with public records. Source unclear. Possible aggregation artifact. I didn't label it as predictive. That idea felt premature and a little ridiculous. Correlation isn't causation. Everyone knows that. Still, I remember pausing longer than usual before closing the file, not because I felt threatened, but because I couldn't think of a clean explanation for why the dataset existed at all. It didn't look like analysis. It looked like output. I spent the next few nights treating it like any other questionable dataset. I pulled old schema documentation from previous contracts and started mapping fields. Some of the identifiers lined up with internal municipal formats that were deprecated years ago. Others didn't correspond to anything I recognized, public or internal. They weren't random. The lengths were consistent, the checksums validated. They just didn't belong to any system I'd worked on. What I avoided doing, deliberately, was assigning meaning. I focused on structure. One thing that stood out was how updates were handled. There were no revisions, no overwritten entries. New rows were appended even when they referred to the same coordinates. It was the kind of design you'd use if you assumed nothing could be corrected later, only added to. That was when I noticed dates that hadn't happened yet. Not placeholders or ranges, specific timestamps, formatted the same way as the rest. Weeks ahead, some months. I flagged them as likely errors. Clock drift, bad merge. It happens when datasets aggregate from different sources. Out of habit, I checked one against the current week. There was a local incident the following night. Sudden, medical. It didn't make the news until the morning after. The coordinates matched exactly. The timestamp was within a minute of the emergency call log. That could still be coincidence. Cities aren't that large. Events cluster. I checked another future entry after that. Same result. Different cause. Different part of town. Still aligned. I kept telling myself I was cherry-picking. You can always find patterns if you want them badly enough. I made a note in my log. Future dated entries correlate with subsequent incidents. Sample size small. What made it harder to dismiss was how confident the formatting was. No conditional flags, no probability fields, just the same flat certainty as the historical entries. It didn't look like forecasting. Forecasts hedge. This didn't. I started staying up later than usual, mostly because I wanted clean blocks of time without interruptions. That wasn't unusual for contract work. I skipped a couple of morning routines, nothing dramatic. I noted it because it was a change. I also noticed I'd started checking the dataset first thing when I sat down, before email. That felt procedural, not emotional. I still didn't think of myself as part of it. I wasn't named anywhere. There were no references to analysts or handlers. I was just verifying consistency, the way I always do. Looking back, that's probably why I didn't stop. The work felt familiar, even as the conclusions didn't. By the end of that week, I stopped logging matches individually. There were too many. Instead, I wrote one line in my tracker. Alignment rate exceeds statistical comfort. Source intent unclear. It wasn't a warning, just a note for myself. I stopped treating the transmission as an isolated artifact once I noticed adjacent directories on the same mirror. They weren't linked directly, but the naming conventions were familiar. Project codes reused prefixes, date ranges overlapped. I pulled a few down and went through them the same way I would any leaked policy set, slowly, assuming context would emerge on its own. Most of what I found were drafts, contingency frameworks, training modules marked internal circulation. The structures mirrored the dataset almost exactly. Same field groupings, same coordinate precision, even the identifier lengths matched. What differed was the language. Ethical framing, where it existed at all, was compressed into footnotes or preambles. Exceptions were listed up front, already approved, rather than handled as edge cases. Over successive revisions, sign-off sections shortened. Individual names disappeared, replaced by role codes or department tags. I made notes on how accountability shifted. Early versions referenced review boards and escalation paths. Later ones routed decisions through automated thresholds tied back to the data fields I'd been mapping. Responsibility didn't vanish, it just became harder to locate. Everything was framed as adherence to protocol rather than judgment. There were slide decks, too. I didn't open the media files. I logged them by title and index number only. Most were operational: response prioritization models, resource staging, public communication timing. None of them described the dataset's origin. They treated it as a given input, like weather data or census projections. One planning memo stood out because it was unusually direct. Buried in the middle of a revision log was a single directive, unchanged across versions. Forecast alignment supersedes reactive validation. There was no explanation attached, no justification. It read like a constraint, not a recommendation. That was when the structure clicked into place for me, though I didn't articulate it that way at the time. The transmission wasn't a record of what had happened, it was feeding something. The policies assumed the data's correctness and built around it. Response models adjusted not to stop outcomes, but to absorb them efficiently. Loss was treated as a variable to manage, not an anomaly to prevent. I didn't feel alarmed reading this, mostly tired. The language was familiar from other municipal frameworks I'd worked with, just pushed further than usual. It explained why the dataset never hedged. Systems that depend on it couldn't afford uncertainty. Looking back, that was the shift. I stopped asking whether the data was right. I started noticing how many decisions were already downstream of it. The transmission wasn't predicting anything on its own. It was being used to decide how prepared the city should be when those entries resolved. The last change didn't come through as an alert. It showed up as a permissions update in my local logs, the kind that usually follows a mirror sync or key rotation. I noticed it because the access hash matched mine exactly, not a group token or inherited role. A new file appeared at the top level of the directory, timestamped a few minutes after my last access. The file structure was familiar: tabulated summaries, revision headers, internal IDs. What was different was the subject. These weren't projections or policy inputs. They were observational summaries of data handlers. Not subjects in the original sense. Analysts, reviewers, anyone with repeated access to the transmission or its derivatives. Fields tracked engagement duration, variance in access patterns, likelihood of disclosure under different conditions. It read like performance monitoring, except the metrics weren't about productivity. One line was flagged in the margin, formatted as an evaluation note rather than a warning. It was the only place where the language addressed anyone directly. Subject active demonstrates acceptable retention. Disclosure risk remains within modeled thresholds. There was no name attached, just the role code I'd been using. I didn't take that as a threat. At the time, it felt procedural, almost reassuring in its neutrality. Systems log what they need to log. I told myself it was a side effect of how comprehensive the dataset had become. If you model outcomes, you eventually model the people handling the model. The rest of the file clarified something I'd been avoiding. The transmission documented endings because systems require closure states, not because anyone cared about the endpoint, but because unresolved processes degrade performance. The same logic applied to information. Either it diffused uncontrollably or it settled into a stable archive. That's why I decided not to release the full data. The internal risk models embedded in the files were explicit about secondary propagation. I extracted only metadata and an outline, enough to preserve structure without enabling reuse. I backed up the archive to cold storage, offline, indexed but inaccessible. Then I revoked my own credentials and wiped the active environment. This post isn't meant to convince anyone. I'm not asking for validation or action. According to the transmission's own logic, belief is irrelevant. What matters is that the record exists somewhere outside the system that generated it. Preservation, as defined in the documentation, is the final requirement. Everything else is just throughput.